government has tried to rectify it, and government has given 3,000 crore per annum for NPCIL for construction of nuclear power plants on fleet mode. But I'm afraid that this is very, very small.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Welcome to Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadhar. Good evening, you're on the gist. In the context of the Conference of Parties in the UAE on climate change, we thought we'd try and bring attention on, amid all the talk of phasing out of oil, coal and gas, we thought we'd try and bring attention on nuclear power, civil nuclear power, which we find is not getting the kind of attention it deserves for whatever reason. I have with me Mr. Dinkar Srivastava, a former ambassador. He has authored a report on renewables for the Vivekananda International Foundation. And there's a complete chapter on nuclear power. And given the slow pace at which nuclear power is progressing in this country, although it is regarded as one of the most efficient and non-polluting, we thought we'd try and take a closer look at nuclear power and how it can play a key role in this whole battle against on climate change. Ambassador Srivastava, first of all, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on your show.
So you have done this report on renewables. When we look at climate change, there's this whole issue of renewables. And are they getting the kind of attention they deserve? If not, for what reason?
Let me clarify. Our report is on India's energy transition, and it covers the entire range of options from renewable high to nuclear high, and it also includes coal with CCS. So we took a technology agnostic approach, and mathematical modeling was done by IIT Bombay. We gave them the task of finding the least cost option for transition to net zero. And their answer was that the nuclear high approach will work out to be cheapest, much cheaper than the renewable high approach. Incidentally, according to UN report, nuclear power has lowest life cycle emissions, much lower than both solar and wind.
Mm-hmm. Are you telling me that building a nuclear plant is less expensive than a solar plant or a hydro plant?
Let me reframe your question. When you are building a rail network, you don't simply build a train. You also have to build the platform and the lines. So there's a system. Now, this is what people forget when there's a comparison between renewable and nuclear, that the renewables at plant level, if you take the plant level costs, they appear cheaper. Even that is not correct. But if you take the systems cost, which includes what is called balancing power and the transmission cost, renewables work out much more expensive. Now, let me explain for the audience what these are. When the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, you still need electricity. So this is supplied by a backup power source, you may call it. In case of rich Europe or America, it is gas. In case of India, it is coal. And this cost of the backup power or balancing power, as it is called in technical parlance, is unfortunately not reflected in the tariffs for the renewables in India. Now, in case of nuclear or coal, this balancing power is not required. Now, let me explain this in a different way. MIT report has brought out that for the same generation which 100 megawatt of nuclear can provide, you need 600 megawatt of renewable. So much higher capacity required for renewable to reach the same generation level accounts for higher cost. And this goes back to the problem of very low plant load factor, which is 22% for solar. India has mainly solar. We don't have much water or land.
Yeah.
And as compared to this, the nuclear or the coal have much higher PLF factor. It's something like 90% for nuclear, 80% for coal. So to reach in other words, if you equalize, what you have to compare is not the capacity, but the generation, because that is what the consumer eventually gets. And the generation with the, same amount of installed capacity will be 4 times higher in case of nuclear, which makes it actually cheaper.
So why hasn't nuclear power taken off in this country? I think it's about 2 or 3% after all these years. Why hasn't it taken off?
That is an unfortunate part which requires a relook on our policies. One obvious answer is that for a long period, nuclear power was under sanctions, and the sanctions started as early as 74 after the first, nuclear test. Second is the fact that nuclear power under Atomic Energy Act is confined only to public sector. And it has that in turn brings some financial constraints. NPCIL, Nuclear Power Corporation, cannot raise resources from stock market. So that is a major constraint. Now, government has tried to rectify it, and government has given 3,000 crore per annum for NPCIL for construction of nuclear power plants on fleet mode. But I'm afraid that this is very, very small. Now, can I explain to your audience something very basic, which unfortunately has not been brought out? We have a installed capacity of 417 gigawatt. The government is planning to take it to 850 gigawatt or so by 2030. According to VIF study, you have to take it to something like 7,000 gigawatt if you are, for 6,000 gigawatt if you are following nuclear high approach, and 5,000 gigawatt if you are having a renewable high approach. So the capacity addition required is very steep, and this requires a whole new approach. And the money will have to be provided by government because so much of money cannot be internally generated by NPCIL. And that brings me to the second point, where again, something which is missed. It's a very basic point. When you decarbonize economy, you have to bring in additional sectors under electrification based on clean sources.
Yeah.
This could only be renewable or nuclear. Now, when you bring these additional sectors under electrification, the demand for electricity goes up. You will bring in the mobility. You will bring in the industry. Right now, it is just the electricity. But these additional sectors will increase the demand. So you have to make an estimate of what is the demand, which load, as it's called, which India will need by 2070. And according to VIF study, this is about 24,000 to 30,000 terawatt hour. Now, there's a CEW study also, which is in the same range, about 24,000 terawatt hour. Now, these figures are completely different from what is projected by, for instance, IEA, International Energy Agency. I'm citing them because they are considered the industry leader. Now, they are projecting 3,400 terawatt hour, which is roughly 1/10 or 1/8 of what we are projecting by 2040. Now, the timelines are different. We are talking of 2070, which is in line with the government projection of net zero by 2070. They are talking of 2040. So I'm not comparing it directly, But what I want to bring out is that India's energy consumption in 2020 was 6,200 terawatt hour. So how can India's energy consumption 20 years down the line be half the energy consumption in 2020, which was pandemic year when the economic activities had slowed down? So there's some fundamentally flawed in IEA prescription. And I would tell very categorically as a prescription to keep India energy poor. And without energy, you will not reach the Swarnkar. So this is a basic issue which you have to keep in mind. The demand load, which is going to be much high, which has no correlation with the previous record because you're bringing new sectors. Now, with this demand load, the generation capacity goes up. Now, if you're following the renewable high approach, the land requirement will go up. And this is the second most important findings of our report. I mentioned the cost. Renewable high approach, according to IIT Bombay's modeling, will cost India $15.2 trillion by 2070. Nuclear high approach will cost us $11.2 trillion, 28% less. But the equally important challenge, bigger challenge is land, because renewables are very land intensive. So for the generation, solar power plant requires 50 times the land required for thermal or nuclear. So according to our study, the total, the land required for renewable high approach will be double the surplus land available now. Nuclear can fit in. But with this kind of high land requirement, nuclear renewable beyond a certain threshold, say whatever government has already announced by 2020,
will not work.
It's not going to work. This is already realized by Europe, and that is why, with the exception of Germany, all of them are focusing on nuclear. And incidentally, Germany has phased down nuclear production. They have not phased down nuclear use because they continue to import bulk of their power requirement, stable baseload requirement from France and Czech Republic, which are based on nuclear power. And incidentally, in the COP28, which is going on in Dubai, about 23 or 25 countries have already signed a pledge to triple the nuclear capacity by 2050. Now, this includes countries like US. Now, what is the significance? US already has nuclear as 20% of their generation, as is India's case. And still, the Biden administration, which is committed to green energy, is talking of tripling this capacity by 2050. So that tells you something that, of the, and these are countries which have both land as well as fossil fuel. And so I think we need to have a relook on our priorities.
Are you getting any indications that India may be moving towards a more liberal regime when it comes to nuclear power?
I can only cite a statement made by Minister of Power, Shri R.K. Singh. This was, I think, on 1st December in Gandhinagar in a conference being hosted by Gujarat Urja Vikas Nigam. And this statement is available in public domain. He said that apart from renewable, we also have to look at nuclear. And in fact, he's mentioned a figure. He said that India may need 200 gigawatt of nuclear power, which is a very positive statement.
You mentioned that so many reactors are being built in fleet mode. I understand 10 reactors was a figure I recall reading somewhere in the media. Are we anyway close to realizing those reactors? Has any of these been built?
I think one of them is already operational, and the others, are in the process. A nuclear power plant takes about 5 years to complete.
Yeah. What about these modular reactors that one keeps hearing about, small modular reactors?
Small modular reactors, the attractive point is that in theory, they are supposed to require less land. So the theory is that the land which will be vacated by existing thermal power plants can be utilized for these small modular reactors. The second aspect is the modular construction is supposed to bring down the time taken, which is a consideration. Now the key element is that contrary to its name, small modular reactors, small, the costs are not small. In fact, costs are very high. And the only, reactor which is commercial, SMR, which is commercially licensed, is a Russian model, which is 40 megawatt. That's too small. That's a barge-mounted thing, but it can be used in places like Andaman, Nicobar. But a larger SMR, there's a new scale, an American company it was developing, and the cost for a 106 megawatt SMR was $6.2 billion. And that cost has since then gone up to $9.2 billion. Now compare this with a figure of $2 billion for a 700 megawatt indigenous PHWR. So you are talking a multiple of 20 times. So this is small SMR, it's a completely flawed assumption that SMR is costly. In fact, it's a flawed assumption that it's going to be cheap. In fact, so costly that NewScale is now in serious trouble because they are not able to find customers to buy electricity, which is that expensive.
Now, our reactors, I think, range from around 300 megawatts to 700. So, what is the focus now? Is it to build 700 megawatts or going for the 1,000 megawatt range that the Russians are helping us with?
I think the indigenous reactor now, which are being constructed, are 700 megawatt. Earlier we had 220 megawatt. And current possibility is that use the 220 megawatt reactors as a substitute for so-called SMR because they are in the same range and they are much, much cheaper. Now let me add something very critical, which again has not figured in public domain. Energy transition is a fight for very limited carbon space. So developed countries in China have not only exhausted 80% of carbon space, they are eating into the remaining 20% also at a much higher pace because their per capita consumptions are high. So according to UN report, existing global carbon budget is going to be exhausted in 11 to 12 years' time, assuming 1.5 degree temperature threshold. So our longer transition time to 2070, longer as compared to China, which is 2060, or West, which is 2050, our longer transition time is not enough to safeguard our interests if the budget itself is getting exhausted in 10, 11 years' time. And coupled with this, there is pressure for peaking of emissions. US and EU have already peaked their emissions, which are now on downward trajectory. China has accepted peaking in 2030. We have not did this for good reason. But can India remain in outlier indefinitely after China accepts peaking in 2030? So maybe we have another 5-10 years. So you are looking at a transition essential, and once peaking hits it, your emissions are peaked. And if they are peaked before you have diversified to clean sources, that will as a constraint on your growth because growth is dependent on energy. So we are looking at a window of 10, 12 years, not more than that. So what is required is to ramp up generation capacity fast within that period. And this requires going in with existing technology. SMR, commercial licensing and production, and bringing down the cost will take more than 10 years. The only answer is to go with the existing technology which we have, that is 700 and maybe 220 megawatt reactors. Cut short the implementation time. That is a challenge. And ramp up the capacity. And during this interim period, we may also have to retain and, in fact, step up thermal. This is exactly what China is doing. This year, they are adding 61 gigawatt of new thermal power plants in addition to 136 gigawatt of thermal power plants under construction. So that takes it to something like 180, 190, almost 2/3 of our total thermal capacity that they are building in this year. This is, after accepting the Glasgow commitments. So we have to have more energy faster before the peaking of emission takes place. This requires going a quick ramp up.
Do you expect any change in policy as far as opening up the nuclear power sector to the private companies?
You are asking I'm the wrong person to answer. You have to ask the government. But, the government has moved to allow joint ventures amongst with PSUs, cash-rich PSUs like NTPC with NPCIL, with NPCIL providing the technology and the project supervision. Now, let me just give you the example of two countries, UK and UAE. Both are rich countries. Both allow not only private sector but foreign vendors. So before the current spat with China, UK had even allowed the Chinese companies to come in, which is now, I think, suspended. And UAE, the Baraka nuclear power plant has been built, not just built, but it's being operated on BOT basis by South Korean consortium. Now, what makes this approach attractive is that these vendors bring in additional capital and technology, because finance is going to be a major constraint. I said that earlier, scaling up at the pace required now, because we are a late starter, it requires a lot of finance.
So the South Koreans also have good civil nuclear power technology.
Yes, they have. And in fact, I don't remember the exact number, but there is certainly much larger capacity than us. Japan,
I suppose
this has to be borne in mind. There's a lot of skepticism about nuclear, security fears and this and that. Japan, which has a pacifist tradition because it was the victim of 2 atomic bombs, and more recently Fukushima disaster in 2011, has restarted its nuclear power plants. There are 55 nuclear power reactors in Japan. So there's a reason. And if you allow me a minute, let me explain what is the reason. In September 2021, North Sea winds dropped in Europe. The electricity prices went up 5 times in UK. They doubled in case of Germany. The reason? Both have wind power providing about 18 to 20% of generation, about 1/5. So if your 1/5 of supply is knocked out, you will scramble for alternate sources. That scramble for alternate source, which was gas, pushed up the gas prices, it pushed up the electricity prices. Why the difference? Why 5 times in case of UK and only double in case of Germany? Because Germany, because of continental location, can draw from the continental grid. UK, being an island, does not have that capacity. They have connection with small. India's situation is much like UK, even though we are a subcontinent, because all our neighbors are energy poor. Deficit. Bhutan, and what Bhutan exports is not enough even for one state in India. So this is also true of Japan, and that is why after about 3-4 years gap after Fukushima, and Japan tried to continue depending on gas, they have now restarted their nuclear power program, and they are going to scale it.
So last question, are there any constraints? Is nuclear power actually seen as a bad boy in India, or something not too great? Does it get a bad press? What is your sense?
Nuclear power gets a bad press in certain sections for all the wrong reasons. And, I might draw your attention. There was some agitation in Tamil Nadu, I think, for that nuclear power plant. And then Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh pointed out that these NGOs which were agitating the issue, they were receiving money from abroad. So there's an agenda. And if, please bear in mind that in case of both US and EU, nuclear power provides 20% of generation. In case of Russia, it is 25%. In case of China, it was 3% like us. They are taking it to 10% by 2035. So obviously, either they know something which we don't know, or we know something they don't know. I think we have to march in tandem with the international community because of our constraints. We have to, reduce the emissions. And the only way to do it, only two ways are renewable and nuclear, as I have already pointed out, both in terms of cost and land requirement. Ramping up renewables beyond the levels already announced will not be possible. And this was, I think the minister mentioned in his statement, he said that the storage cost which renewable requires is as much as 10 rupee per unit. So, this perception that renewables are cheap, rupees, take into account this storage cost. There's a recent study which came out 3 months ago by Central Electricity Authority, which is a government body. And they have set the cost of renewables round the clock ranges from 5 rupees to 7.5 rupees. This is based on 6 hours of battery storage. In a day, you have 24 hours, so 6 hours are not enough. Sun is available only 12 hours, or at least 7-8 hours. So 6 hours will take you to 12-13 hours, but you need electricity. Even otherwise, storage. The cost, according to government body, is now ranging from 5 to 7.5 rupees, which is double or triple the tariff, which is what shapes the public perception.
So hopefully India will do a rethink on its current method of dealing with civil nuclear power and do the proper reforms necessary to give a boost to this sector. Hopefully they will see daylight soon. Ambassador Srivastava, thank you very much for your insight. And it was good listening to these insight details and perspective from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you now on The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good night.